It's time for round 2. Elden Ring impressed hugely with its recent network test for just a limited time, showing how an open world twist on Dark Souls will work. And wow, does it work. We have until 25th of February 2022 before we see the full package, but just this Limgrave region gives such a variety of bosses, of spells and abilities, of side ventures like crafting, of hidden dungeons to explore, and more tantalizingly, areas in clear view but just outside the demo's remit. Even more impressive is that Elden Ring's a cross-gen release. It scales to 7 consoles in total, yes, 7, some with quality and framerate modes that take us up to 10 permutations of Elden Ring to try. Actually make that 11 if you count the PS4 app running on PS5, but anyway. Still, the network test gave me a good window to try each console in turn, or as much as I could capture anyway before the servers switch off till February. We've already seen how Xbox Series X, S and PS5 fare. All are beautifully presented, especially at a 4K resolution on Series X and PS5 quality modes, but each struggles to hit 60 FPS on their framerate modes. For last gen consoles, well, there's no mode toggle here, but from PS4 to PS4 Pro, Xbox One to One X, there is a lot of good news here. It's an early sample, of course, this being a beta test months ahead of Final Code arriving, but I found it a surprisingly strong turnout. That being said, some clear drawbacks are in place on base PS4, and especially on base Xbox One. The big question then, how big are those visual cutbacks on last gen systems? How does the framerate hold up? And what of loading times? Let's find out. I think a good place to start is with the resolutions. Base PS4 is up first, running at a native 1920 by 1080, so pretty standard, with the same temporal anti-aliasing method as seen in Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. You also have a 30 FPS cap on PS4, with uneven frame pacing and drops under 30 occasionally, which we'll get to later. And visually speaking, consider this the standard setting for consoles in foliage density, shadows and texture quality. In other words, what you see here in visual feature set on base PS4 is also what you get on PS4 Pro and even One X. The resolutions do of course go higher on Pro and One X, but grass and shadow settings stay in place. Of the 4 machines, it's really the base Xbox One here that's the outlier, the exception. Resolution wise, this runs at 1600 by 900, not unexpected, and it runs with the 30 FPS cap, with uneven frame pacing again. But in regular side-by-sides, you can see just how much of a downgrade Xbox One is, even compared to a regular PS4. The most obvious cutback on Xbox One is, as you can see, in foliage density. This is what we consider to be Elden Ring's low preset for grass, and it does sadly affect the artistic direction intended for the game. It's stripped back more so than even base PS4 as we walk towards the Tree Sentinel boss, leaving a rather patchy and barren stretch. All across Limgrave, this is the reality of running Elden Ring on the weakest console of the 7. It's a serious concession in order to try hold 30 FPS on Xbox One, along with, you may have spotted, the low-grade texture filtering on gravel roads. Likewise, for shadow quality, base Xbox One is downgraded to produce the lowest setting of all last-gen machines. Shadow degradation is admittedly less noticeable, but outlines for trees, characters, render at a lower resolution across the world. And while we're here, you may notice ambient occlusion is also potentially cut back too. Note the visibly lighter appearance to shading across the woodlands up ahead. It's a strange artifact, possibly a bug, bearing in mind we are in beta territory, but a big difference in how shadows render on Xbox One. Of the 2 consoles, PS4 is undoubtedly the one to pick. The texture filtering, the shadows, the foliage all render at a medium level setting, below Series X, S and PS5, but above Xbox One's. There's another bizarre drawback to Xbox One worth touching on too. In select situations, like this battle near the carriage, enemies on base Xbox One update at around 15 FPS. Even meters away you can see their animation refresh is far out of sync with the 30 FPS targets of the rest of the action, the camera, your attacks. Bizarrely, it doesn't happen outside the Stormhell gates with a similar large cluster of enemies, so again it's limited to certain scenes. Still, the result is a bit jarring when it's so close. It's like a Ray Harryhausen stop motion scene. This trick's nothing new to Souls games either, but in Elden Ring it's Xbox One that appears to depend on it most. Next, let's turn to the enhanced machines, PS4 Pro versus Xbox One X. This one's less surprising in terms of pure comparisons if you've played Sekiro. Both share the same presets for textures, grass, shadows, and so on. Also, and alas, there's no toggle for frame rate or quality as there is on PS5 or Series X. You get one way to play. The big difference, the one which has a real impact on frame rate, which we'll get to, is in resolution. PS4 Pro runs at 3200 by 1800, but much like Sekiro, a form of reconstruction is used as well. Judging by the camera cut as we meet Margit the Fell, it's likely a checkerboard method common to the machine, halving the pixels rendered on the horizontal axis. As a result, PS4 Pro pushes a less sharp image than Xbox One X, which renders at a straight 1800p, at peak anyway, without signs of this reconstruction method. That being said, One X still depends on dynamic resolution scaling. This means we get 1800p as the peak looking to the sky, but then it bottoms out at 1512p lowest, like during the Flying Dragon battle. The overall effect, well, oftentimes One X is rendering more pixels per frame than PS4 Pro, resulting in a slightly clearer image. One last question on visuals. Where do last-gen consoles stand next to the modern equivalents? What's the next-gen difference in Elden Ring? To answer, let's start with a pure Xbox comparison. Here's base Xbox One, One X in the middle, and Series X in its quality mode on right. The spread shows elements like grass density scale evenly with each jump, where One X settles for a kind of middle-tier preset. Likewise for shadows, these three use different settings, low for base Xbox One, medium for One X, and high for Series X in the quality mode, though this high setting only applies on its quality mode. Interestingly, if we're talking resolution, One X pushes a higher overall pixel count than the newer Series S console, so if we swap the consoles around a bit, you can see One X falls behind Series S in foliage density en route to the Tree Sentinel. But in rendering at a range of 1512p up to 1800p, One X actually does have an image quality advantage over Series S's 1440p maximum target. One X and Series S have their own pros and cons. Next up, let's try the exact same for the PlayStation machines. Just a quick one really. Here you can see what Elite PS5 offers in image clarity, at a peak of 4K with DRS, compared to 1080p on base PS4 and 1800p reconstructed on Pro. We also get a big foliage setting upgrade over the last gen machines. PS4 and Pro use the same grass density setting and shaders as well. Overall, it's hard to be too disappointed with the visual turnout on last gen. PS5 is clearly the preference, with a flourishing meadow right in front of you, but the older two don't really miss out too drastically. Perhaps the biggest difference though isn't how performance manifests. In frame rate targets, where base PS4 and Pro have a very different approach to PS5. It's time for frame rate testing, the first port of call being base PS4 and Xbox One. Question is, are base machines really in a good state in the network test? After all the visual cutbacks, the dropped resolutions, foliage, and in Xbox One's case, even enemy animation quality, is it all effective so far in targeting 30 FPS? Or is there more work to do by that February release? So let's start with PS4 first. It's 30 FPS capped of course, with the uneven frame pacing we've often seen on From Software engine titles. Yes, sadly, there's no escaping it in Elden Ring either. Despite hitting 30 FPS for long stretches, even basic dungeons, the uneven distribution of frames still creates that juddering sensation, so it may still feel like a drop. Expect to see this a lot, across the grassy plains, the swamps, the hidden dungeons. PS4 often averages at 30 FPS, even if it doesn't quite feel like it. There are drops under 30 to look out for too. Close-ups against enemies can dip the frame rate to the 20s, if only briefly. We see it in the woodland area for a second too, and riding quickly through the Storm Hill section. The biggest and most sustained of these is against the Flying Dragon, putting us down to around 27 FPS. Otherwise, PS4 is pretty nicely optimized in broad terms, 30 FPS, a 1080p picture, and respectable settings for foliage and shadows too. It's just that persistent frame pacing issue, causing the graph on left to trill between targets. If in an ideal world From Software could even this out, by keeping the frame time fixed at 33.3 milliseconds per frame, PS4 would be a very attractive offering. Right now, if you're familiar with, say, Bloodborne, expect the same level of performance here. Moving on, let's switch to base Xbox One. Sadly, the network test build has Xbox One running between 25 and 30 FPS, so hopefully there are improvements to come by release. What we know so far though is, we have the same uneven frame pacing issue as PS4, plus more egregious drops. That's in battle with multiple enemies, in woodlands pushing us down to the mid-20s, and even this horseback section which held at 30 FPS on PS4, which struggles on Xbox One, all despite a lower 900p resolution and stripped back grass. Now, in fairness, a bulk of the time it does hold at 30 FPS, just expect the frame rate drops to hit even lower lows than the PlayStation equivalent. We see Xbox One at its worst in the marshes for the Flying Dragon battle, which just glances the 20 FPS line here. Again, I really hope this can be turned around for that mid-February release for those that aren't ready for a console upgrade. Right now, this is the version most in need of attention. Enhanced consoles next up. I'm opening the graph range here from 0 to 60 FPS this time for a simple reason. PS4 Pro and One X are unlocked to 60 FPS. However, the fact is, well, as you can see, neither is even close to hitting the full 60 and are often more between 30 and 40 FPS in practice. So here's PS4 Pro to start. It's very rare to go sub 30 FPS, but it is possible. I've seen brief dips under during alpha heavy attacks at the Storm Hill gates. I've seen moments where it goes under during travel. On the whole though, PS4 Pro absolutely could lock at 30 FPS with a few drops under if a cap was added. Likewise on One X, the game is free to run up and down that graph. There's nothing especially wrong with the performance if it were 30 FPS capped, but here, it's just so variable, jumping from 30 to 40 and beyond, looking right up at the sky. There's an extra twist to this. Comparing Pro and One X against each other, as best I can anyway, Pro is consistently ahead in open world travel. The margin is often quite considerable too. The opening dungeon is almost 15 FPS ahead on Sony's machine as we ride the lift. That flattens out between them at around 30 FPS, emerging to Limgrave's open fields, and really there's nothing to split them on foot. We see it again in fast horseback riding through enemy dense areas too, a notable lead on Pro hardware. And lastly, there's the cutscene with Margit the Fell, delivering a frame match stress test that puts Pro ahead by as much as 15 FPS again, before gameplay kicks in again. The best theory as to why? Well, despite One X being the more powerful 6 teraflop machine against PS4 Pro's 4.2 teraflops, the fact is Pro's reconstructed image is less taxing overall to render. We see One X occasionally take a marginal lead in battle, but on the whole, it's got an image quality advantage in pixels pushed, and it pays the price for it in performance. A final word on loading times. Without the luxury of the rapid NVMe SSD storage in current gen machines, we're entirely at the mercy of stock drives on last gen here. Of course, your results may improve if you've upgraded your PS4 or Xbox One system. Just looking at PlayStation systems first though on their stock drives, PS5 wins out at 6.6 seconds when first booting the game, but interestingly we have base PS4 and Pro come in at almost the same 19-second mark, around 3 times the wait. You'll be fast travelling around Limgrave too quite often, so it's crucial getting around to use that map, but here again we see just around 6.6 seconds on PS5, travelling to the First Steps Site of Grace, up against 22 on the older machines. Curiously, I have noticed base PS4, in these tests at least, coming in a second or so faster than the Pro model, but nothing drastic. Another round still on Xbox machines. As we know, the Series X and S consoles aren't quite as speedy as PS5, with the network test build putting them at around double the weight to respawn or fast travel. Still, 12 seconds on each is a good saving on base Xbox One's 22 seconds, though bizarrely we see the One X model lag far behind all last gen systems at 32 seconds in loading the Fringe Folk Hero's Grave. And later tests too, fast travelling to the first step, puts it at a huge 40-second wait compared to even the base Xbox. Potentially this is down to lower quality assets loading in on base Xbox One, less data to decompress for the base machine, but it does seem extreme. Again, we'll see how this works in the final game. That's about all I have today on the Elden Ring network test. 7 platforms, 2 modes, 3 months to wait till we see the game in full, and really I can't wait to revisit the lands between. Everything here is to be taken for what it is, of course. These are early tests, but it's looking like the next evolution of Dark Souls I've been dying to see for years. My honest view, to make a wish list for the final game, and if From Software is listening, I'd ideally want a 30 FPS cap on Pro and One X. That just makes sense to me, given the state of performance right now. And to be more demanding still, I'd want this 30 FPS cap to be evenly frame-paced on all 4 consoles. I'd also hope One X gets its loading times optimised a bit too, since 30 to 40 seconds wait on a respawn seems a bit much. Otherwise, well, I'm pretty happy with the state of play for last gen. It's scaling surprisingly well, incredibly well in fact. Barring the heavy cutbacks on Xbox One, they're all shaping up to be viable, enjoyable ways to explore From Software's latest. That's all for today though. If you did find this video useful in any way, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell to get notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, I'm on Twitter as always. But from me for now, thanks for watching.